So, as you just saw, and there are hours and hours of this, we've been very lucky over the 10 years we've done the conference to have Steve Jobs as a frequent guest. He did 6 sessions here, and as far as I know, he didn't do that at other conferences. And so we're going to do something that's our little thank you in memoriam to him, which is we're putting the whole collection of Steve Jobs appearances at the D conferences on iTunes free. I guess right now there should be a URL there. They've been the first one I think isn't even anywhere on the web, and the others have been on the allthingsd.com website, but they've been, you have to kind of poke around to find them, and so there's a whole special section in the podcast area of iTunes where you can download these and view them and keep them. The other thing we thought we would do is what I'm about to do right now, which is to bring out 2 people very close to Steve. You've just seen them talking about their own businesses and interests, but now we're just going to talk about sort of what were the lessons. Since his death, lots of people have talked about what they think his career meant and how to replicate it or how to take lessons from it. But these 2 people, Ed Catmull and Larry Ellison, were very close to him. Ed, of course, worked very closely with him at Pixar. Larry was perhaps his best friend, and we thought that would be the kind of duo that should know something about the subject of the legacy. So, Ed and Larry, could you come on out?
I want to tell you that is filled with things to say.
So, the Wall Street Journal ran a story recently about how CEOs are trying to copy what they think represents how Steve Jobs was a success. It even included, if I remember correctly, somebody I can't remember who he was or what his industry was, who decided to start wearing mock black turtlenecks. I guess on the theory that if the CEO dressed that way, everything would go right. I don't know.
Did it work?
I guess we'll have to follow up. I don't know. But Ed, when you think about Steve's career and you work with him so closely at Pixar, why was he so successful?
Well, I'd have to say that over the time that I knew Steve, which is 26 years, which was just as he was forced out of Apple, that he went through, I'd say, some very distinct phases. And in the first phases, where he had a sort of a reputation, I think people misunderstood him and what he was doing. But what I found over the time was that he was learning from those mistakes. That the way he negotiated, the way he interacted with people initially didn't work very well, but he was so incredibly smart that he changed his behavior. And a lot of people didn't get this or didn't see this, but the Steve for the last several years that I knew he was very kind, he was very empathetic with people, and when he negotiated, as I saw him do with Disney, there was the notion of fairness and partnership, which is very strong. And those things weren't there earlier, but he was so smart that he learned how to do it.
So part of his success was this adaptability and eventually the transition to being better able to partner.
Yeah, it was basically, when you test the boundaries, which some people do, and he was a person that did test the boundaries, when you do that, what do you do with it? Or let's take something which you hear a lot about, and it is CEOs would say, my employees are my most valuable asset, and the culture is extremely important. But with Steve, he built a building. And the building, I think, is one of the most extraordinary work environments I've ever seen.
You're talking about the Pixar.
The Pixar building. And this was Steve's design, and it was very cultural. And it was because he thought about what it meant to say that your people were the best and the culture was the best. And it translated into an environment that was unlike what other CEOs would do, who would use the same words. So if you copy Steve, you say, oh, people are important, blah, blah, copy all this stuff. But they didn't see what he was really doing, which is a deep understanding, which it turns around and affected what he made, or what he directed.
Larry, why was he so successful?
Well, in addition to his obvious genius, which helps, he had a single-mindedness and an attention to detail unlike anyone I've ever seen. And if you look at he insisted on, and he was a bit of a control freak,
He was?
A little bit, just a little bit. And he wanted to engineer every aspect of the user experience, let's say, for the iPhone, including what happened when you walked into the store, how you paid for it, or how you paid for an iPad with your, how you saw it in the store. Obviously you bought it from AT&T. How you paid for an Apple product with your credit card in the store. How, if the iPhone was sent to you, or the iPhone was delivered to you, or the iPad was delivered to you, what it looked like in the box, the detail of the box, what it was like to open the box, what you saw when you first opened the box, how you bought an application, how you connected to the network. I mean, every excruciating detail he was personally involved in. I don't think people really understand. Edison had this comment, it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Steve was a god of perspiration. I mean, Steve worked incredibly hard. It wasn't just his intellectual gifts, which were enormous, but how he took that horsepower and applied it tirelessly until the entire problem was solved. I've never seen anyone like that.
You run a big company. You just were talking about it. You have run a big company, both of you. I assume you both work really hard. I mean, there's only so many hours in the day, so much you can work. So I appreciate that he worked very hard, but was there something different about his ability to focus, or was it this control freak thing, or what?
Well, I'll tell you. Let's talk a little bit about Pixar. And Steve's my best friend for about 25 years. I think we knew him for about the same length of time. Very interesting how we met. We were neighbors in Woodside, and his peacock wandered onto my property and woke me up. Not the way to start a relationship in a friend. His girlfriend had given him a peacock, and I came over to complain about the peacock. Said, "You don't like that bird either, huh?" and said, "I hate that bird. I don't get up at 6 in the morning. Let me explain it to you. I'm a programmer. I need my rest so I can think." He said, "I hate that bird too." I said, "I'm going to tell her that you complain so much about the bird. We got to get rid of it. You got to back me up." Because it was my birthday present. She got it to me for his birthday. Worst birthday present. Anyway, that's how we met. So, well, I've got a lot of very, very funny stories about Steve. But Steve, everything Steve did, he would just not let go of a problem until it was solved. I guess that's the best way to describe it. It's not that he just put in the hour. If he had to stay up all night, if he stayed up night after night after night, he would call me up and say, "Larry, let's get together." We saw each other a lot. He'd come over to my house. I'd go over to his house. I said, "Steve, I'm not coming over if you make me watch Toy Story again." I've watched 73 different versions of Toy Story. Now, I know the new version of Render Man is 4% better than the one I saw last week, but I'm not watching this thing again. So, Larry, you got to see. You won't believe the different the shadows look. I don't care. You don't understand. I'm not coming unless you promise me that you're not going to make me watch. I promise, but just a little of it.
This is before the movie came out.
Before the movie came out, yeah. And that was Steve. And we go over there, and he'd have the mock-up of the Apple stores, and we go over to the warehouse, and Oracle did the software, by the way, for the retail software, and he's just complaining about it to me. Steve, it's Sunday. You're saying how terrible the Oracle software is to check. Now, I'm in your stupid store in the warehouse. You know how many times I've come over on Sunday, and we're walking through the checkout But that was Steve until it was perfect. And then once it was perfect, and then he moved on to the next problem. But working obsessively until he had a solution that was insanely great is what Steve was all about. And an idea, I'll go back to the network computer. We had this idea, I had this idea. It's a simple device attached to the internet. I'm now done. Idea now fully formed. Boy, that was a good idea. What do you think, Steve? That's a good idea. Building that thing is really hard. Let me tell you what you have to do. A, B, C, And then Steve then proceeds, to build the iPad. There's a big difference. There's a reason. Ideas, there are a lot of good ideas.
There are a lot of good ideas in this room.
There are a lot of good ideas. Translating a good idea into a great product is unbelievably hard. There are so many details. People accuse Steve of stealing, the Macintosh from Xerox, with the Alto computer. I was at Xerox Park, so I used the Alto a lot. Finishing the Alto and turning that into the Macintosh was enormously complicated. And there were so many things that had to be done that Xerox had not done. There were a few good ideas in the Xerox machine. But Steve would translate good ideas, not always his good ideas, but he would translate good ideas into finished product unlike anyone in our industry. Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he made it cheap, and he made it popular, and he made it accessible to the American people. Steve would translate good ideas into finished, brilliant products.
So Ed, with regard to Pixar, was Steve as deeply involved in all these little details as Larry was describing him at Apple?
Steve never came to a story meeting. He was not involved in any of the local things. And it was actually pretty amazing. And that was the agreement. He trusted that other people knew things that he didn't know. He did have a great camaraderie with the directors, though. It was really good. And it's a thing I think that people don't understand about Steve, is that Steve was a master storyteller.
Storyteller.
He was a storyteller. And a good storyteller is working on, or one who makes up stories, is working on the components of it. And they'll try something new, and they commit to it. So Steve would come up with an idea, and he would commit to it. And he would roll it out to people. And for some people, that commitment would say, whoa, the great Steve has spoken. But in fact, what he wanted was the pushback. So people argue back with him, and if it didn't work, he'd go back and redo it. That's what storytellers do. That's why he really got with them. And when he thought about the presentations that he made, he worked over and over again. He tried these ideas, and if they didn't work, he'd go back and redo them. And he understood that's what the directors did. So he was supporting them. He was not trying to do what they were doing. He was never trying to say, make your story this way. He trusted them to do that.
So that's a little, it's interesting because I think he was involved in stuff like the color of the wood and the tables in the Apple stores and all that kind of stuff in the Apple, or what kind of a angle a certain product's edge would have.
Absolutely.
But not with the Pixar films.
No, it was interesting, and I knew that first of all, I knew his heart intellectually was in Apple. That was clear all along. There was something about that where he self-identified with. But he appreciated the passion there. But he was so brilliant. He knew the difference. He knew when he needed to be in it, because that was him, and he knew when he needed to support us. And because he knew the difference, he could succeed in both fronts, which were very different from each other. So one little example had to do, early on we were making Bug's Life, and the artists wanted to make it widescreen. The marketing people didn't at that time want to sell widescreen movies because they didn't fit well because these black bands on the top. So Steve agreed with him. It was a bad marketing decision. But we were in a meeting, and there were a bunch of people there, and they showed an image widescreen, and Steve started to argue with the production designer. And the production designer argued back with him. So they had this sort of red-faced argument going back and forth about whether or not this was a good thing. And it ended sort of just, it frittered away, and then Steve went out to the next thing. The poor guy came up to me and was freaked out because he'd been arguing with Steve. So I said, "You won the argument." Because all Steve wanted to know was, did he have the passion behind it? Because passion counted. It was part of the calculus of the value of something. And because the passion was so strong, he never brought it up again, and it went out widescreen.
Ed talked about him as a storyteller. Do you think that applied at Apple?
Well, I'd like to emphasize, one of the things Ed just said, which was, Steve did want to debate things. I mean, Steve didn't think it was important whether it was his idea or someone else's idea, as long as it was the best idea. Steve was definitely one of those people where the best idea won. Now, he had to, he's a very smart guy, and you had to be able to persuade him, but he would listen. I mean, whether you were yelling or speaking quietly, it really kind of didn't matter. He would listen because he wanted to build the best possible products, to deliver.
So there is this image that he was like a czar who just ruled by fiat at Apple.
Well, he would make the final decision, so he'd be the final arbiter. But his idea, now I've had discussions with Steve and Steve in meetings where he didn't agree in the beginning, and he was persuaded, and and when he changes like that, boom.
This is what Tim Cook was saying last night.
He bang. I mean, he'll just move over to the best idea. What he wants is the best idea, the best product, the best movie, the best store, the best everything. And if he thinks someone's better than he is in a certain area, he's very good at listening. If he thinks you're full of it, he'll tell you.
And it's phenomenal to watch him because he really would flip. And you just saw this. And he would argue something, and you had to have the force of will, but he wanted somebody to argue back.
Yeah.
He didn't respect somebody if they didn't have a point of view and push it hard. And if they were right, he switched. I never saw anybody so much who understood there's no percentage in being wrong. Just right to his core, he understood that.
Yeah, I think people who are insecure, and I don't think in this, certainly Steve was not intellectually insecure. But he knew he was a very smart guy, and he knew. When he decided that someone else's idea was a better idea than the one he had, he immediately adopted that as his own and moved on instantly. It wasn't this vanity. He was afraid that he was embarrassed about being on the wrong side of an argument for a while. He didn't care. All he cared about was the outcome of building the best product. Whosever ideas went into it, he would just pick a menu of this best idea, that best idea, that best idea. Whether it's his or not, it didn't really matter.
So Larry, what about this storyteller thing that Ed mentions? Could you think about the Apple marketing in that context, or?
Oh, I think Steve was a remarkable leader. I mean, Steve, I think, inspired people to do great things, and whether he was recruiting somebody, whether you want to call it a marketing pitch or telling a story, when he was recruiting someone into Apple or motivating a team who had been working, we work very, very hard getting a product out the door by a certain date. You're working 6-7 days a week, 16 hours a day. You haven't seen your family in a long time. I mean, it's quite a commitment. And Steve would come in and make very inspirational speeches that what you were doing was important. And he made you feel that you were important because you were important to the success of this product. The importance of the product to the company, the importance of the company to its customers. And he was a very inspirational, charismatic leader that people believed in. They wanted to be on his team because his team was doing very important things.
So why did Apple lose the PC war to Microsoft, and why did he get forced out, and why did Next not work if he was so good at all these things?
He wasn't then. I mean, seriously. The whole point is he learned from those things. Then by the time he came back to Apple, he had learned enough lessons about negotiation, about clarity, about how to interact with people that were stronger than they were initially.
Do you agree with that?
No. I think the Macintosh predated the learning. What was, to me, fundamental is, did he learn? Did he become less brutal to people he worked with? Absolutely, because I've seen Steve be brutal. And Steve was brutal because he desperately wanted to be great. He wanted Apple to be great, and he wanted the product to be great, and he wanted you to be great. And if you weren't doing your best work, he was upset. He was angry. He was, because if we do this right, we can build something that's so great, we can't screw this up. And you saw him take the Macintosh and finish the Macintosh, or even before that, the Apple II, but then the actual delivery of the Macintosh, which was an enormously difficult project that he got through by a combination of his leadership, which was he was a young man. He was a very young guy, and he was tough on the people around him. He tempered that. He understood that people did not enjoy being made to feel like they were failing, that they weren't doing a good enough job. People don't like that. People don't come to work to understand I'm not doing a good job. They didn't find that inspirational, and he learned. He was more compassionate, and he was a nicer person. And as we all get older, I think we all learn to be a little more empathetic. But I think the essentials of his genius. I think that was finishing school. And it's very important as human beings because that was a much nicer Steve to deal with on a daily basis. But the essentials of his genius was there from the very beginning.
Well, I would agree with that, but I think the Macintosh, which was so clearly far superior to what Windows was, didn't win because those other elements weren't there. And when I say Steve learned, because he had that genius, I agree there, but he learned those other skills, so by the time he got back to Apple, he was able to take the superior product and basically blow it forward because he was no longer weak in those other areas.
Yeah, no, I think he lost his job probably because he didn't negotiate with the board well enough. I mean, so I agree that he made himself vulnerable because he relied so much on what he did and how brilliantly he did it that he expected the Apple board to recognize that he was kind of irreplaceable, that Apple had more need of him than he had need of Apple, kind of thing, which was some quote Napoleon said about France. But the Apple board didn't like the way he behaved. Now look at the young geniuses in Silicon Valley right now. If they don't like their boards, they fire their boards. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, if they don't like the board, get rid of them. If Mark Zuckerberg doesn't like his board, get rid of him. To some degree, I think that's a result of what Apple did to Steve. As a young man, the Apple board made a terrible mistake because of his, if you will, superficial personality characteristics. He wasn't as nice to the board members, perhaps, as they would. He wasn't as politic. He didn't learn, to smooth out those rough edges, and that cost him his job and almost cost Apple its existence when they got rid of him. So he got better at that. But no, to me, I mean, from a very young man, this was an extraordinary guy, and you could see it from the very beginning.
So if you were just talking about some of the younger major leaders, but still young in the Valley, in tech.
They don't trust their boards anymore. They don't trust. It's very interesting. If the board of directors can fire Steve Jobs, it is interesting. I mean, Larry Page and Sergey Brin have control of Google. They can fire the board. The board can't fire them. Mark Zuckerberg has control of Facebook. They can fire the board. The board can't fire them. I think this is the Steve Jobs, Apple dismissing Steve Jobs in favor of a guy whose only track record was flavored water, was such an incredible mistake. Why should they trust these guys? Why should Zuckerberg and Page trust these guys?
So it's like almost a Bible story in the Valley, the firing of Steve Jobs and sending him off.
Yeah.
So there is this great effort to take lessons from his career, and as I said, it even gets so silly, it affects how people dress or something. But you both knew him, and you've talked about it. How would you advise someone who wanted to model the Steve Jobs career or the Steve Jobs method or the Steve Jobs success is basically what they want to model? What would you tell them to do?
Well,
I mean, it could be people in this room. It could be people who will watch this video.
yeah, I mean, to me, trying to copy Steve means they're going to stop at the surface. I think conceptually, copying Steve or emulating Steve is the wrong thing to do. Partly because some people are so unique that to copy them is only to parody them in some ways, in a way that doesn't work. And he truly was unique. And so you try to be like him, what does that mean? I do think there are principles for how you think about things, how you explore the boundaries, how you keep yourself from getting caught up in a conservative way of thinking, and the way you keep yourself from being blind from things. Steve had the facility to do that. Most people don't. And if they can work on their personal view of life and how they tackle problems and how they open themselves up, they'll have a greater result.
Well, I think you cannot copy Steve. I think you can ask yourself some basic questions if you're like him. I mean, if there's an unsolved problem and you're at work, can you think about anything else? So if you want to know if you're like Steve Jobs, so if you are unable to think about anything but this problem.
So if you want to go to the movies.
Yeah. And it has nothing to do with being successful. You're not thinking about, oh my God, if I'm Steve Jobs, I can go out with this person, I can date this person, and I can buy this house. And if you think about the benefits of being famous and rich, then you're missing the whole point. If you want to know you're like Steve Jobs, it's very simple. You are unable to think about anything about these serious problems at work, and that's all you can do, and you obsess about it until you solve it, and then you move on to the next thing, and you obsess about that until you solve it, and then you obsess about this until you solve it. It is, that obsessive compulsive personality combined with this incredibly, and obsessive compulsive personalities are not all that rare among successful people. The obsessive compulsive personality combined with this peculiar genius of Steve's, which was both aesthetic. We talk about the building. He loved architecture and design. He loved. He was an amateur architect. He loved product design.
He wasn't an engineer, though. He wasn't a coder.
He wasn't a programmer. I'm a programmer, but he had enough knowledge of what went into the product, whether it was the microprocessor or the operating system. He had a pretty deep knowledge about all of that technology. Very smart boy. He learned very fast. Might not have been a professional programmer, but his understanding of the complete system, the gestalt, the whole thing, the whole system, and how to fit those pieces together. I mean, he would take this puzzle and assemble these pieces into the iPad. And there's a lot of complicated software pieces. And he'd work with the engineers, and he was a great editor. He was a wonderful editor, at least in terms of editing the software and user interface as it was developed. He was a great editor of process in the stores. He would constantly review things and continuously make them better until he was marginally satisfied, and then they could release the product. If you have that kind of obsession combined with Picasso's aesthetic and Edison's inventiveness, then you were the next Steve Jobs.
So that's the test.
Easy. Yeah. Easy. Yeah, I mean, this guy's not, when I...
So there really are no lessons to take from it unless you take that little test and you match up.
No, I think there are a lot of lessons, but to try to model yourself after Steve Jobs, I mean, again, it would be like, well, okay, what do I have to? I'd like to paint like Picasso. What should I do? Should I use more red?
See, here's the problem I have with modeling yourself after Steve. Because I remember John and I were up there, and he was showing us the iPhone before it came out, and it was a very emotional time because he talked about his disease and what he wanted to do for Apple and Pixar and for his family. But as he held this phone, he said, the thing that makes this so hard to copy is the software. He made a big deal of that. Now, he loves the design, but the fact is, on the outside, most people talk about it, they say, what makes this so cool is the design. So they're coming out and looking at it from the outside, not realizing that the value is something really complex. And I think the same is true for Steve. They come out, and the silly example, of course, is the clothes. But if you look at the superficial things that he did or the peculiarities he had, both positive and negative.
Like his ability to stand on a stage and present
it's the wrong
product
thing.
in a way that...
If that's what you're copying the wrong thing. And there are a lot of lessons, but they're not about the design, as important as design is.
So is one of them this ability to start something and finish it? Is that a...
Let me say, the guy who's copying his clothes is about missing the point about it, but much you can miss it. Steve wore the same thing every day because he didn't want to think about what he was wearing. I don't want to spend any time. I go, take this, put this on, put that on, I'm done. You do the same thing every day. Woody Allen has the same meal in the same restaurant, the same table. It's not because, they just don't want to think about that. They're thinking about other things. So if this executive's not going to be just like Steve Jobs, now it's really important that the way I dress. Steve didn't care about the way he dressed. That was not an important issue for him. He didn't care. Apple became the most valuable company on earth, and it wasn't even one of Steve's goals. He never, he wasn't trying to be rich. He wasn't trying to be famous. He wasn't trying to be powerful. He was obsessed with the creative process and building something that was beautiful.
Did he manage that company in a way where he was conscious of or talked about the stock price or making the quarter or any of that stuff? I mean, because they were in a lot of trouble at one point.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean,
well, when it was survival, when it was survival, sure. I mean, it was very tough. But it was all about. I was on the board, and it was all about survival. But no, Steve was always talking about products and creating the next product and the product after that. He really was a creative artist, engineer, entrepreneur, unlike anyone. I mean, I know he called me up when Apple passed Oracle in market cap at around $150 billion. Larry, a lot of people measure their manhood here in the Valley by market cap. I said, okay, Steve, all right, okay, nice job. But then it just kept going up and up. It's getting ridiculous. I call him, stop it. You're making all of us look bad. But no, he noticed and he was proud of it, but it was not a motivator for him at all. It was just kind of a measure that he was doing the right things, that people loved the Apple products and they were buying a lot of them. Therefore, what he was building was in fact beautiful.
Did either of you think he was nuts to do the stores when it started?
No.
Did you immediately say that's a great idea? I mean, I realized you were at Pixar and you had your own hard
I have
problems
fewer
to solve.
opinions about stores, but I mean that's one of those areas.
But you obviously heard about it, you knew about it. What was your reaction to that?
No, the reaction is first of all, Steve wouldn't pursue something like that unless he were fully committed to make something exceptional. So for me, frankly, it was, engaging because I love to hear him talk about what they were doing and how they were presenting. But it was more successful than I would have thought it would be at the time.
How about you? What was your sense of it? He must have bounced it off you.
Bounced it off me. He dragged me to the warehouse. I went through those stores more times than I care to admit. Eventually we'd be driving towards the warehouse in his Porsche, and I said, no. I think I'm throwing myself out the door, But he drove so bloody fast.
This was the warehouse where they had a mock-up
where they mocked up the stores. Yeah. No, I commented, it's really interesting that Dell was at the time, Dell was kind of the hot company, and everything was being sold across the internet, and bricks and mortar was just, nonsense, right? It was a joke. And
Gateway has actually just had to close their stores. They had stores.
And it's just like, but Steve must really be stupid. Steve, aren't you reading the newspapers? Everyone, it's just bricks and mortar's dead. And he said, well, we're not using bricks and mortar, we're using glass and steel. Oh, well, that changes everything. I've got this really cool stairway. And you have to love him. The brilliance of not being a follower, the brilliance of being a contrarian, the brilliance of understanding Apple is really a lifestyle brand. And people want to, and these stores if you do them right, they're going to be iconic. And now, if that's your goal, to be, to build a store that looks like it was built like that kind of reminds you of, there's the Apple store and IM Pei's pyramid over entrance to the Louvre.
There is an Apple store.
There is. Only Steve would set that as a goal. For these stores, that it would help build the brand and also give him distribution and without giving up a lot of margin, without giving a lot of profit margin. He could do brand building. He was completely contrarian at the time. Everyone said that he was nuts. It's a lot of fun.
What did you say? Did you say it was nuts?
No, I didn't say it was nuts. I thought it was very risky, but because I saw the designs. I saw the designs of the store, but utterly brilliant. I'd never expected there would be as many stores as there are now. I thought there would be a modest number.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because the first one happened to open near Washington, D.C., where I live. And I get this call from Apple saying, we're opening our first store here at a mall in the suburbs, and there's going to be a press preview, and Steve's coming out, and would you come? And I said, geez, I hate going to these big group things, and I'm going to walk through a store, and
exactly.
And then I think he called me and said, I'd really like it if you'd come. So all right, it's a half hour from my house. So I drove over there, and we're walking through, and he's talking about the translucency of the glass in a certain place.
No, exactly.
And I said to him, is this really the best use of the time of a CEO to worry about that? He goes, it's very important. And then I said, kind of what you just said, I said, you're only going to open maybe a dozen of these, right? These are like showcase things, right? You're not. And he looked at me like I had just landed from Mars, like I was the stupidest guy in the world. Yeah. And he said, oh, we're building a lot of these. Yeah. And I said, well, what do you know about retail? And he said, well, I hired this guy, and I hired this guy, and we had this warehouse, and we had this, thing, and we're going to make this work right.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm not Steve Jobs, but
Yeah, well, that was remarkable. But again, you just see this contrarian nature, that if everyone's doing this, maybe what if they're wrong? What if they are wrong? And there's a lot of followers in the Valley. There's a new trend. I remember I was with Michael Dell, and I said, when the PCs were first becoming popular, right? I said, Michael, there's got to be 50 PC companies in the United States. I said, Larry, there are 500. 500 guys making PCs. That can't be right. They can't have 500 guys basically doing the same thing. And eventually they all died. Or almost all of them died. There are almost none left. But there are a lot of copiers. And Steve was not a copier. He's an original. A lot of people have copied Steve, but the stores is just another extraordinary example of him noticing when everyone's talking about bricks and mortar being dead, Steve saying, maybe not.
Well, let's end it there. Thank you, too. And take some questions if anyone has any. Okay. Well, we wanted to do a remembrance of Steve and what made him great, and you two made that happen, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.